What could possibly make a man who has everything, a millionaire with power, prestige, and luxury at his fingertips, regret one single decision for the rest of his life? Imagine this: a sleek black Mercedes parked under the glowing lights of a rainy New York street, its leather seats carrying the scent of wealth and privilege. Inside sits Richard, a businessman who has built his empire on confidence, ambition, and a belief that money can solve every problem. And then, out of nowhere, a poor child approaches his car window, soaked from the storm, with eyes full of both fear and hope. Instead of kindness, Richard responds with coldness. Instead of compassion, he chooses arrogance. In a single moment, he kicks the child out of his life, never suspecting that in just minutes, his entire world would begin to unravel. Have you ever seen a moment where arrogance blinds someone so deeply that they fail to recognize the truth standing right in front of them? This story takes us into that exact situation. Richard believed that wealth gave him the right to judge who was worthy of his presence and who wasn't. To him, this child was nothing more than a distraction, a poor boy who dared to step too close to a life of polished suits and tinted windows. But what Richard didn't know was that this small encounter on a stormy night in the United States would open wounds from his past and reveal a truth he wasn't ready to face. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next may change the where you see moments of arrogance, humility, and second chances. Picture Ethan, the child in this story, 10 years old, with shoes that have lost their soles and a backpack that has carried more struggles than schoolbooks. He's the kind of boy most people walk past on the street without stopping, but his presence carries something powerful: innocence, humility, and a silent plea for kindness. Ethan wasn't asking for luxury. He wasn't begging for money. All he wanted that night was a little help, maybe a ride out of the rain, maybe a sign that the world wasn't always so cruel, and yet the answer he received was rejection in its harshest form. Can you imagine the pain of being turned away, not just by anyone, but by someone who could have made a difference with nothing more than a small act of compassion? But here is where this story begins to twist. Because Richard, the man who thought he had all the power, would soon realize that the child he dismissed so easily wasn't just another nameless face in the crowd. The very thing he tried to push away would come back, forcing him to confront secrets from his own family, regrets he had buried under layers of wealth, and a truth that money could never erase. What you're about to discover now may surprise you. Sometimes the greatest lessons in life don't come from boardrooms, penthouses, or million-dollar deals. They come from the places we least expect, from the small voices we ignore, from the eyes we refuse to meet, from the people society overlooks. This isn't just a story about wealth and poverty. It's about the contrast between arrogance and innocence, power and vulnerability, rejection and forgiveness. It's about a man who believed his car, his money, and his status placed him above everyone else, only to learn that a single poor child held the key to his greatest regret, and perhaps his redemption. As the rain continued to fall that night, Richard had no idea that the necklace the boy carried, the photograph, inside it, and the fragile thread of memory it represented, would pull him into a past he thought was gone forever. And so, as Richard grips the steering wheel of his luxury car, trying to brush off the sting of guilt after sending Ethan away, something catches his attention, something small, fragile, and impossibly familiar. What he is about to discover will shake him to the core. And maybe this is the moment where I should pause and turn to you, the one listening right now. Because stories like this are not just about Richard or Ethan, they're about us. Have you ever witnessed something unfair? A moment where someone with power looked down on someone who only needed a little kindness? Or maybe you've been in Ethan's shoes, carrying hope in your heart only to be met with rejection. If this stirs something inside you, I'd love to hear your voice. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share an experience, a feeling, even a simple reflection. It's not just about adding words under this video. It's about creating a space where we recognize ourselves in these stories and remind one another that compassion still matters. And while you're here, if this story is already speaking to you, don't forget to tap the like button. It may seem like a small action, but each click tells me that these stories of humanity, of arrogance turned to humility, of pain transformed into lessons, are worth telling again and again. Your support is what gives these narratives a chance to reach someone else who may need to hear them today. More than that, consider subscribing to this channel, because what we're building here is more than just entertainment. It's a community, a place where every week you can find stories that stir your emotions, challenge your perspective, and maybe even soften your heart. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel, you're standing alongside everyone who believes that empathy and connection still have a place in this world. Your participation truly makes the difference. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber, it all helps carry these messages further, touching lives we may never meet, but who, just like Ethan, might be waiting for a reminder that hope still exists. And as Richard is about to discover, sometimes hope comes in the most unexpected way. Richard had always believed that his story was one of triumph. From the outside, his life looked like a picture painted to inspire envy. Sleek luxury cars that reflected the city lights of Manhattan, a wardrobe filled with the finest Italian suits, and a penthouse high above the noise of New York, where the skyline stretched endlessly in every direction. He was the man others pointed to when they said, "That's success." But behind this carefully built image was a man who measured worth in dollar signs and saw people as obstacles or opportunities, nothing more. His mindset was sharp, calculated, but dangerously shallow. For Richard, compassion was an unnecessary weight, a distraction from the pursuit of more. The truth is, he didn't start out this way. In his early years, he knew struggle. He understood what it meant to look at a bill and wonder if it could be paid. But somewhere along his journey of climbing the corporate ladder, that memory blurred, then faded, and eventually disappeared. He convinced himself that the only way to keep moving forward was to harden his heart, to erase empathy in favor of efficiency. If someone needed help, that was their burden. If someone fell behind, that was their failure. It was a transformation so gradual that even Richard didn't realize how much humanity he had lost. And yet, others around him saw it clearly. His colleagues admired his results, but whispered about his coldness. Waiters, drivers, assistants, anyone who crossed his path felt the sting of his impatience, his dismissive gestures, his clipped tone that said, "Your presence is tolerated only because it's useful." In his mind, New York was a battlefield, and to survive, he believed one had to be ruthless. That was the hidden truth of his success, the part no motivational speech would ever include. A heart locked away, guarded by arrogance. And so it wasn't surprising that when Ethan, a poor child, approached his car that rainy evening, Richard's first reaction wasn't curiosity or care, it was irritation. To him, this boy was not a person with a story, not a child with feelings or needs. He was a problem, an interruption, an inconvenience daring to cross the invisible line that separated the powerful from the powerless. The decision to push him away wasn't calculated, it was instinct, the reflex of someone who had trained himself to dismiss anything that didn't fit his perfect narrative of control. What makes this moment even more striking is the contrast between the outside image and the inside emptiness. Richard's world looked polished. A private driver always on call, a calendar filled with meetings at high-end restaurants, vacations, in places most people only see in magazines. But that lifestyle, shiny as it seemed, was hollow without empathy. The impact of that hollowness wasn't visible on the surface. It lived behind the scenes, in restless nights, in shallow relationships, in the quiet voice he never allowed himself to hear. When you look at a man like Richard, it's easy to assume he has no regrets. But the truth is, Regret often hides until the exact moment when the past comes crashing into the present, and that's what makes this encounter so powerful. In a single decision, Richard would be forced to confront not just the boy in front of him, but the reflection of who he had become. A reflection he could no longer ignore. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding Richard isn't just about painting the picture of wealth and arrogance. It's about revealing how mindset shapes destiny, how small choices, repeated over time, can build walls that separate us from compassion, how the pursuit of power without purpose leads not to fulfillment, but to emptiness disguised as achievement. And in Richard's case, how a rainy night, a poor child, and a single careless action would trigger revelations he never saw coming. Comment here, I see the hidden truth. Ethan's world could not have been more different from Richard's. While Richard looked down from glass towers at the city that fed his ego, Ethan looked up at the same skyline with wonder, imagining what it might be like to live in one of those shining apartments. His home was not a penthouse, but a cramped, aging apartment building on the edge of Queens, where the paint peeled from the walls and the smell of dampness seemed to linger no matter how many windows were opened. He lived with his grandmother, a frail woman who had raised him since he was barely able to walk. Her health had declined over the years, leaving her with slow steps and tired eyes. But to Ethan, she was the most important person in the world. Every morning, Ethan woke before school to make sure she had her tea, carefully setting the chipped mug in front of her before he left. He didn't complain about the old sneakers with holes in them or the fact that his backpack was frayed at the edges. To him, these were just things, and things could be endured. What mattered was her smile when he came home with a small bag of groceries, or the way she squeezed his hand and whispered, "You're my little gentleman." That was enough to give him strength. Despite the heaviness of poverty, Ethan carried himself with quiet dignity. His clothes might not have been new, but he kept them clean. His hands might have been small, but they were always ready to help, carrying neighbors' trash, sweeping stairs in exchange for $1, or running errands at the corner store. He wasn't waiting for charity, he was searching for opportunity. That was the hidden truth about him. Behind the fragile appearance of a child was a resilient heart that refused to give up. On the streets, Ethan often watched the flow of cars with fascination. He'd point out models to himself, whispering their names like secrets. Mercedes, Cadillac, Lincoln. He didn't envy them in bitterness, but in curiosity. To him, each polished car represented a different story, a glimpse into a world so far from his own. And yet he believed, somehow, that if he stayed kind, worked hard and kept hope alive, life could open doors even for someone like him. That rainy evening, when his path crossed Ethan had already endured a long day. His grandmother had been coughing more than usual, and the medicine bottle was almost empty. The pharmacy was too far to walk in the storm, and buses were unreliable that night. So when he saw the luxury car parked near the grocery store, he gathered his courage. He didn't see a millionaire inside. He saw only the chance to ask for a small favor, a ride that might save his grandmother from another night of suffering. It takes bravery for a child to approach a stranger, especially one wrapped in the armor of wealth. Ethan's voice trembled, but his words were polite. He didn't beg. He simply explained, his eyes searching for understanding. And in that moment, his vulnerability revealed something powerful, a reminder that kindness costs nothing, but its impact can change everything. What makes Ethan's story so compelling isn't just his poverty, it's the mindset he carried in spite of it. Many in his situation might have turned bitter, angry, at the world for dealing them such an unfair hand, but Ethan chose hope over despair, resilience over defeat. His journey, though marked by hardship, was also marked by courage, and perhaps that's what struck people most when they looked at him. Not the worn shoes or the patched clothes, but the quiet determination shining through his eyes. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because Ethan's life isn't just background detail. It's the very contrast that reveals the heart of this story. When arrogance meets humility, when selfishness collides with selflessness, something transformative is bound to happen. Ethan's presence forced Richard to face the impact of his decisions, and it would uncover revelations that no amount of money could prepare him for. Right here, I believe in resilience. The storm had settled over New York like a heavy curtain, the kind that makes the sidewalks glisten under streetlights and forces people to quicken their steps. Richard's Mercedes rolled to a stop near a small grocery store, its engine humming softly, a stark contrast to the crack of thunder above. He tapped his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel, annoyed that he even had to stop in such a neighborhood. To him, it was a place he would normally pass without a second glance, a behind-the-scenes reminder of the city's less polished corners. Ethan, meanwhile, stood under the awning of the store, clutching his worn backpack to his chest, the rain dripping from his hair and soaking through the thin fabric of his shirt. His grandmother's medicine weighed on his mind like a stone, and with every car that sped past, his hope flickered and dimmed. Then he saw the black Mercedes, sleek, powerful, a machine that looked like it belonged to another world entirely. His heart pounded, not with envy, but with courage gathering itself for a leap. He took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see Richard's face through the tinted glass. The boy raised his hand, hesitant at first, then knocked lightly on the window. Richard sighed, irritation flashing across his face. He lowered the glass just enough to hear Ethan's voice, thin and uncertain against the backdrop of rain. "Excuse me, sir. I was wondering if you could help me. My grandma is sick and I need to get home. Could you give me a ride? Just a few blocks." It was a simple request, delivered with politeness that few adults in Richard's circle ever bothered with. But to Richard, it was an intrusion. His eyes narrowed, scanning the boy up and down, taking in the frayed backpack, the waterlogged shoes, the desperate look. Instead of seeing a child in need, he saw an inconvenience, a reminder of the world he had worked so hard to leave behind. His mind, trained to dismiss anything that didn't serve him, reacted with cold reflex. "Get away from my car!" Richard snapped, his voice sharp and cutting through the storm like a blade. Ethan's expression faltered, confusion flickering across his young face. He tried again, softer this time. "Please, sir, I don't mean any trouble, But Richard's patience had run out. He pushed the door open just enough to force the boy to step back, his tone laced with disdain. "Do you think you belong here? Don't touch my car. Go bother someone else." People passing by slowed, their umbrellas tilting as they watched. A couple whispered to each other, one shaking their head. The scene, brief as it was, carried the weight of humiliation. Ethan felt it like a physical blow, not just the rejection, but the way Richard's words stripped away his dignity in front of strangers. Still, even in that moment, he lowered his head and murmured, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to upset you." His apology, pure and undeserved, only deepened the contrast between the arrogance of the man and the humility of the boy. Richard slammed the door shut and adjusted his jacket as though brushing off the encounter. To him, it was just another interruption, a minor annoyance to be forgotten as quickly as it had come. Yet behind his irritation, a faint echo stirred, a whisper of memory he tried to silence. He convinced himself that he had done the right thing, that protecting his space was necessary, that people like Ethan didn't belong in his world. What he failed to see in that moment was how decisions made in arrogance can ripple outward, creating impact far beyond what the eye can measure. The truth is, this was more than an encounter on a rainy night. It was a collision of two mindsets, one hardened by pride, the other softened by need and resilience. Richard believed he was preserving his status, but in reality, he was planting the seed of regret that would grow into something he could never have predicted. And Ethan, though drenched and dismissed, carried himself away with the same dignity that had always defined him, unaware that this brief, painful moment would soon reveal hidden truths about his own life. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because the heart of this story lies not just in the cruelty of rejection, but in the revelations it sets into motion. Sometimes the smallest encounters, the ones we dismiss in seconds, hold the power to transform an entire journey. For Richard, this night would become the moment he could never take back, and for Ethan, it would be the beginning of a connection he never imagined possible. Comment here. I felt the impact of this moment. The street seemed to hold its breath in the seconds after Richard's words cut through the rain. The sound of the storm filled the silence he left behind, but even that couldn't mask the weight of the moment. People walking by slowed their pace, some lifting their umbrellas to get a clearer look at what had just happened. A wealthy man in a tailored suit, stepping out of a luxury car, had spoken to a child as though he were less than nothing. The contrast between power and vulnerability, privilege and poverty, was so raw that it pierced through the ordinary rhythm of the city night. A woman carrying groceries clutched her bag tighter and shook her head, whispering something under her breath to the man beside her. Another passerby frowned deeply, his eyes lingering on Richard with open disapproval, before looking back at Ethan with a softness that the boy couldn't even see through his lowered gaze. Nobody spoke loudly. New Yorkers had learned to mind their own business, but the energy in the air was unmistakable. Judgment hung heavy, and though Richard pretended not to notice, the sting of it pressed at the edges of his pride. Ethan, on the other hand, felt the humiliation seep into his skin, like the cold rain soaking through his shirt. He had tried to stand tall, to speak with the respect his grandmother had always taught him to give, but his small voice trembled now. Lowering his head, he whispered words that barely carried through the storm. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to bother you." The apology was quiet, fragile, yet it held a power that Richard didn't recognize because it revealed innocence standing against cruelty, humility meeting arrogance without anger. For the people watching, that whisper echoed louder than Richard's sharp dismissal. It was a reminder of something uncomfortable, a truth hidden behind their own daily routines, that it's often the ones with the least who show the greatest grace. The impact of the scene reached beyond just the two of them. It unsettled strangers who would go home later still thinking about it, replaying the image of a child apologizing for existing while a man with everything brushed him aside. That's how moments like these spread their influence. They don't end on the sidewalk. They live on in the minds of those who witness them. Richard tried to brush it off. He adjusted his jacket, shifted in his seat, and told himself it didn't matter what others thought. After all, he had built his entire life on ignoring opinions, on pushing forward no matter who disapproved. But somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of arrogance, the weight of the stares lingered. It wasn't just disapproval, it was exposure. For a man who lived to control how others saw him, this unguarded glimpse of his cruelty felt like a crack in the image he worked so hard to maintain. Ethan's response, however, wasn't about pride or image. It was about survival. He knew how quickly kindness could turn into rejection, how asking for too much could close doors forever. So even in that moment of pain, he chose humility. That decision wasn't weakness. It was resilience, the same resilience that had carried him through days without enough food, nights spent listening to his grandmother's labored breathing, mornings when he walked to school with shoes too thin to keep out the cold. His apology wasn't just words, it was a reflection of the mindset he had learned to embrace. And that mindset, though invisible to Richard, carried more strength than the millionaire's fortune ever could. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic because the way people react in moments like these tells us more than words ever could. Behind the scenes, our decisions and our behavior don't just impact the people directly involved. They ripple outward, shaping the way strangers view us, shaping the lessons they carry home. In Richard's case, his coldness revealed a hidden truth about himself, but it also revealed something about society. The way wealth can blind, the way power can harden, and the way innocence can still shine through even in humiliation. This wasn't just an embarrassing encounter, it was the beginning of a revelation that would soon transform everything Richard thought he knew about himself and his world. Comment here, I can feel the contrast. The rain had begun to ease, but the tension Richard carried with him refused to fade. He leaned back into the comfort of the Mercedes, forcing his mind to move on, telling himself the boy was just another interruption in a long day. Yet even as the windshield wipers dragged across the glass, clearing streaks of water, something inside him remained unsettled. He adjusted his cufflinks, tried to focus on the next meeting, the next deal, the next performance of control, but his thoughts kept circling back to the image of the child lowering his head and whispering an apology. It wasn't guilt he wanted to admit to himself. It was irritation at the fact that he couldn't shake the feeling. Then he noticed it. At first, it was just a glimmer against the wet pavement, a small object lying near the curb where Ethan had stood moments before. The boy must have dropped it while stepping back from the car. Richard narrowed his eyes, hesitated, and then, almost against his will, pushed the door open and leaned down to pick it up. It was a necklace, delicate, simple, clearly old. The chain was worn, its clasp slightly bent, but in the center hung a tiny locket. Richard almost tossed it aside. He had no use for trinkets like this, especially ones belonging to strangers, but his hand lingered, curiosity tugging at him. Absent-mindedly, he thumbed open the locket, expecting to see some faded picture of a cartoon character or perhaps a snapshot of a neighbor. What he found instead froze him in place. Inside, behind the glass, was a photograph he recognized instantly. His breath caught. The edges of the photo were worn, the colors slightly faded, but the face, staring back at him, was impossible to mistake. It was someone from his past, someone whose absence had left a wound he thought he had buried beneath success and distractions. His pulse quickened as memories began to surface, fragments of conversations, laughter, arguments, regrets. For years he had avoided them, locking them away the way he locked away anything that threatened his carefully controlled image. Yet here, in his hand, was proof that the past wasn't finished with him. The hidden truth struck him with a force he hadn't expected. This boy, the one he had dismissed and insulted so easily, was connected to him in a way he couldn't yet fully grasp. The locket wasn't just an accessory, it was a bridge, a revelation waiting to be understood. And suddenly, the arrogance that had fueled his reaction just minutes before began to feel paper-thin, unable to shield him from the impact of what he now held. Outside, life continued, as though nothing had changed. Cars splashed through puddles. Neon signs flickered, strangers hurried by under umbrellas, but for Richard, the city blurred. He couldn't take his eyes off the photograph, the familiar face locked inside the locket. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a coincidence, perhaps the boy had found it somewhere, perhaps his mind was playing tricks. Yet the longer he stared, the more undeniable it became. The connection was real, and it was staring back at him from the past he had tried so hard to forget. His chest tightened, not from the rain or the cold, but from something deeper, the dawning realization that his decision, so casual, so cruel, was not just another dismissal. It was personal. It was intertwined with his own story in ways he hadn't yet unraveled. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something crack inside the armor he wore so proudly. It wasn't guilt alone. It was fear. Fear of what this meant. Fear of what he would discover if he chose to follow the thread the locket had just placed in his hands. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic because the turning points in our lives rarely come announced with fireworks. More often, they arrive quietly, hidden in the ordinary, disguised as accidents or coincidences. Richard thought he was simply brushing off a poor child, protecting his comfort and ego. But in reality, he had stepped into a moment of revelation, a shift that would force him to confront not only the child's story, but his own. That is the impact of decisions we make. Without thinking, they can circle back, carrying truths we never expected to face. Comment here. I believe in turning points. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he held the locket closer, his eyes locked on the faded photograph inside. The face staring back at him wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a vague resemblance that could be explained away. It was her, his sister, the one person in his past who had loved him unconditionally, who had defended him even when others turned away, who had carried pieces of his childhood that no one else could ever understand. The storm outside faded into background noise as another storm began to rise inside him, one far more unsettling. Her name whispered itself in his mind like an old memory he hadn't dared to say out loud for years. The woman who had once been his closest friend, then his fiercest critic, and finally his greatest regret. They had fought bitterly, over choices, over values, over the way Richard had chosen ambition over family. In his climb toward power, he had left her behind, convincing himself that cutting ties was necessary, that distance was a form of self-preservation. Pride had built walls between them that neither had managed to break down before her sudden death. And now, here she was again, not in the flesh, but in a photograph carried by a child who had just stood at his car window, begging for a little kindness. The revelation struck him like a physical blow. Ethan wasn't just a boy from the streets. He wasn't just another reminder of poverty Richard thought he had escaped forever. He was family. He was blood. He was the son his sister had left behind, the nephew Richard had never cared to meet. All those years of avoiding phone calls, of ignoring letters, of telling himself that family ties were too complicated, had brought him here, to a rainy street, holding proof of the very life he had chosen to turn away from. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. His heart pounded in his chest as flashes of the past flooded his mind. His sister's laugh, her stubborn determination, her tearful voice the last time they spoke. She had told him he was becoming someone unrecognizable, someone who valued money over people, image over truth. He had scoffed at her words then, brushing them aside as envy or weakness. But now, staring at the photograph, he realized she had been right, and the child who had just apologized for bothering him was living proof of that truth. The irony burned. Here, he was a man who could buy almost anything, yet the one thing he had ignored, the bonds of family, had come back to confront him in the most unexpected way. It wasn't just a hidden truth uncovered. It was a revelation that shattered the foundation of the image he had built for himself. How many times had he told himself that the past was irrelevant, that success erased old wounds? But no amount of polished suits or high-rise apartments could erase the fact that he had rejected not only his sister, but also her child. His thoughts spiraled. What kind of man does that make me? The question echoed inside him, louder than the storm. It was no longer about a poor boy asking for a ride. It was about a nephew he had cast aside without a second thought. Every decision Richard had made out of pride, every moment he had chosen ego over empathy, now carried a new weight. The impact wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a name, a living reminder standing in the rain only minutes earlier. And in that instant, the polished image of Richard the successful businessman cracked open, revealing the emptiness beneath. He wasn't just a millionaire sitting in a luxury car. He was a man confronted by his own failures, by the family he had abandoned, by the truth that money couldn't rewrite. His journey had always been about control, about climbing higher, but now he stood at a crossroads that no deal, no transaction could navigate for him. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because family ties are powerful in ways we often underestimate. They linger in the background, shaping our identity, influencing our choices, even when we try to ignore them. Richard had thought he could sever those bonds, that success would free him from the weight of unresolved conflict. But life has a way of circling back, of placing us face to face with the decisions we'd rather forget. And sometimes the greatest revelations come not from victories, but from the hidden truths we've tried hardest to bury. Comment here, I believe in hidden truths. Richard's chest tightened as he sat motionless in the driver's seat, the locket heavy in his hand. It was strange how such a small object could weigh more than any deal he had ever signed, more than any empire he had built. The photograph inside had pulled back a curtain he had spent years holding closed, and now he couldn't look away. His sister's face, captured in that frozen moment of time, stared at him with a mix of love and memory, and all he could feel was the sharp edge of regret cutting through the armor he had worn for so long. The guilt hit him first. It wasn't the kind of guilt that passes quickly, the sort that can be drowned in expensive wine or buried under the distraction of another meeting. This was the deeper kind, the guilt that comes when you realize your choices have reshaped the lives of others, not just your own. Ethan's voice replayed in his mind, soft and trembling. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to bother you. He had brushed off countless people in his life, dismissed requests, ignored needs, but now he understood that this boy wasn't just anyone. He was family, blood. And instead of recognizing that, Richard had pushed him away with cruelty. Shame followed close behind. He remembered the looks of the strangers on the sidewalk, the subtle whispers, the quiet disapproval that hung in the air. Normally, Richard didn't care what others thought. He thrived on being untouchable, on living above the judgment of ordinary people. But this was different. This wasn't about his reputation in boardrooms or headlines in business magazines. This was about humanity, about decency, and he had failed in front of witnesses who would forget his name but remember his actions. In that moment, Richard felt small, smaller than he had ever felt, as though the weight of their silent judgment was more unbearable than any financial loss. And then came the fear, not the fear of being exposed, but the fear of seeing himself clearly. For years, he had defined himself as successful, powerful, in control. But now, looking at the locket, he realized that success had been built on a foundation of avoidance. He had avoided compassion, avoided connection, avoided the messy truths of family and responsibility. And what did that make him? A man who could command respect in a boardroom but couldn't show kindness to his own nephew. The thought clawed at him. Who have I become? The inner conflict was suffocating. Every decision he had made out of pride now resurfaced like ghosts haunting him. He had told himself that ambition justified everything, that cutting ties was necessary for survival. But now he saw the cost more clearly than ever. His sister had been right. His arrogance had not only isolated him from her, but had also blinded him to Ethan, a boy who should have been part of his journey all along. The hidden truth was undeniable. In climbing higher, Richard had left behind the very things that once gave his life meaning. The transformation stirring inside him wasn't dramatic yet. It was quiet, unsettling, like a shift in the ground beneath his feet. For the first time in years, Richard questioned the very foundation of his mindset. The cars, the suits, the penthouse, all of it suddenly felt fragile, like props in a performance that no longer convinced even him. What mattered now wasn't what he had, but what he had lost, and worse, what he had willingly thrown away. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because moments of inner conflict are often the beginning of real change. They strip away illusions and force us to confront the impact of our decisions. Richard wasn't just facing shame in front of strangers, he was facing the hidden truth of who he had allowed himself to become. And sometimes that realization can be more terrifying than any public humiliation, because it demands a transformation from within. It demands that we choose a different path. Comment here. I feel the weight of this conflict. Richard sat frozen in his car, the weight of the locket pressing into his palm, the storm outside reflecting the storm inside his chest. Guilt and fear churned together, but beneath them, something else began to stir, an urgency he couldn't ignore. He couldn't let Ethan disappear into the night. Not this time. Not when he finally understood who the boy truly was. With a sudden motion, he shoved open the door, the cold rain hitting him instantly, soaking through. His perfectly pressed suit. For once, he didn't care. He stepped into the street, his polished shoes splashing through puddles, his eyes scanning desperately for the small figure he had just pushed away. Down the block, he saw him. Ethan, head bowed, backpack clutched tightly, walking slowly through the storm. His steps were heavy, not just from the waterlogged shoes, but from the weight of rejection layered on top of a childhood already too burdened. Richard's throat tightened. That was his nephew, his sister's son, family he had abandoned without even trying to know. Without thinking, he started running, his breath visible in the night air, his heart pounding harder with every step. "Ethan!" The name tore from his lips, raw and unfamiliar, but it carried a power he hadn't felt in years. The boy stopped, turning slowly. Confusion etched across his rain-drenched face. He hadn't expected to hear his name from the man who had just humiliated him. For a moment, he looked ready to bolt, to vanish into the shadows. But Richard closed the distance quickly, stopping just a few feet away. And then something unthinkable happened. Richard, the man who had never bowed to anyone, lowered himself to his knees right there on the wet sidewalk. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. The expensive fabric of his suit clung to his frame. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the look in Ethan's eyes, the mixture of fear, sadness, and lingering hope. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice breaking in a way he hadn't heard in years. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you that way. Please forgive me." Ethan blinked, stunned. He had never seen a man like this, a man who looked untouchable, brought low by sincerity. For the first time that night, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a problem to be brushed aside. He felt seen. He clutched the straps of his backpack tighter, unsure whether to believe this sudden transformation. But the crack in Richard's voice told him it was real. Richard reached out, not to demand, not to control, but to offer. "You don't have to walk alone in this rain. Let me take you home. Let me help your grandmother. I should have been there a long time ago, but I wasn't. I can't change the past, but I want to do something now." Every word felt like pulling down another wall inside him. Walls built from pride, from stubbornness, from years of running from the truth. For the first time, humility flowed more easily than arrogance. As they walked back toward the car, side by side, Richard's mind raced with revelations. This wasn't about charity, about saving a poor boy to polish his image. It was about redemption, about finally stepping into the role he had denied for too long. Ethan didn't just need shelter. He needed family. He needed someone who would stand beside him in the struggles. Someone who could lighten the burden carried by a sick grandmother and a child too young to carry so much alone, bringing them into his. Life wasn't going to be easy. It would mean opening wounds, confronting the past, admitting to himself and to others that he had been wrong. But for the first time in years, Richard felt that was exactly what he needed. This was the transformation his sister had pleaded for when she was alive. This was the journey he had avoided but could no longer deny. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because real redemption doesn't happen in a single moment of apology. It happens in the choices that follow. It's about creating new patterns, rewriting old narratives, and facing the hidden truths that once seemed unbearable. Richard's kneeling in the rain was only the beginning of his transformation. The true impact of that decision would unfold in the days and nights to come, shaping not just his future, but Ethan's as well. Comment here, I believe in redemption. The rain eventually slowed, but the memory of that night never would. Richard drove Ethan home, the silence in the car thick, but strangely comforting. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to fill the space with business calls or idle chatter. He simply listened to the sound of Ethan's breathing, to the quiet hum of the engine, to the storm finally fading into the distance. When they reached the small apartment where Ethan's grandmother waited, Richard stepped inside cautiously. The space was modest, filled with the scent of old wood and the warmth of a life built on love rather than wealth. It was a stark contrast to his own sterile penthouse, decorated with expensive art, but lacking the presence of real family. Seeing the frail woman in her chair, her eyes lighting up when Ethan entered, shook Richard to his core. Here was the woman who had raised his nephew while he stayed absent, who had carried the weight of care and sacrifice while he turned away. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and quiet strength, as though she understood far more about him than he wanted to admit. And, in her gaze, Richard felt something he hadn't in years: accountability. It was as if the universe itself was holding a mirror to his choices, showing him not just what he had gained through ambition, but what he had lost by abandoning compassion. Wealth, he realized, had given him status, but it hadn't given him peace. It had built walls, not bridges. And what was the use of standing at the top of a tower if you had no one beside you to share the view? The hidden truth of his journey was now undeniable. The emptiness he had tried to ignore wasn't from not having enough, it was from not giving enough. He had thought control and independence was strength, but now he understood that strength was in connection, in allowing himself to care, in choosing empathy over pride. The transformation unfolding inside him wasn't just about Ethan or his grandmother. It was about Richard himself. He had spent years performing a version of success, but this night had stripped away the act, revealing a man who desperately needed redemption. And the irony was as humbling as it was beautiful. The key to that redemption had been carried by the very person he had pushed away. A poor child, standing in the rain, apologizing for asking for help, had unlocked the part of Richard's heart he thought was gone forever. That's the impact of kindness. It doesn't only change the life of the one who receives it, it transforms the life of the one who gives it. In that moment, Richard realized that wealth, without compassion, is nothing more than emptiness dressed in luxury. The cars, the suits, the skyscrapers, none of it mattered if he couldn't kneel down in the rain for a child who needed him, because sometimes the person we reject is the very one who carries the truth we've been running from. Sometimes the greatest lessons don't come from victories or profits, but from moments that humble us, reminding us what truly makes us human. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic because behind every encounter like this lies a decision about what kind of person we want to be. We can choose to ignore, to dismiss, to protect our pride, or we can choose to see, to listen, to act with compassion. Those decisions don't just shape the lives around us, they shape us. They become the legacy we leave behind, the story that others will tell about who we were. And in Richard's case, his story was no longer about arrogance, but about the possibility of change, the chance to begin again, the courage to finally step into the role his sister would have wanted for him all along. Every act of kindness has the power to change a life, including our own. That is the hidden truth that money can never replace, the revelation that no empire can buy. It's the behind-the-scenes force that gives meaning to everything else. And for Richard, for Ethan, for the grandmother who had carried them both in different ways, this was the beginning of a new journey, one built not on pride, but on compassion. Comment here, compassion gives life meaning. And if you're still here with me, it probably means this story spoke to you in some way. That already tells me we're building something meaningful together. If you felt the weight of this message, let me know in the comments by writing, "I'm with you until the end." It's always powerful to see how many of us are connected through these reflections. And while you're here, tap the like button. It's a simple gesture, but it helps keep these stories alive and ensures they reach more people who might need to hear them. If this kind of content resonates with you, consider subscribing. That way, every new story Every new lesson will find its way to you without you having to search for it. And before you go, there's another video right here that complements what we've been talking about. Click and continue with me there. I think you'll find it just as powerful.